Okay, well, welcome to Office Hours. I'm here with Philip, whom you know, and Professor Bowl is out gallivanting somewhere. Actually, he's giving a series of very distinguished lectures in Hong Kong, the Chenmu lectures at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. A very great honor for him and an opportunity for any of you who are in Hong Kong this week. We're here to talk about this last week's section, really focusing on Wang Anshi and his opponents. And we got a lot of feedback, and a lot of this feedback, we're going to start with what we call a self-criticism. And a lot of you found the assessments, the reading, confusing. So first of all, a lot of people said, not too much reading. I agree. Professor Bo always assigns too much reading. Wait till the second half of the course, it'll be a lot better. Second, a number of students said that they couldn't finish this week because of that, and so they really feel behind. Some people said, and even this is, that the reading is boring, and they prefer videos to reading. Now, we really do want people to continue to read, but we do, of course, have videos as well. Finally, the assessments are confusing, and I have to say, when I look at these assessments, sometimes I have real trouble too. So you are not alone. And Philip, can you explain? One question in particular was a real mess.
We did have one problem with actually two questions that echo the same things. You've pointed out a very important problem, and it's that the two questions basically lead us astray. And the question asks about Sima Guang's concerns with Wang Anshi's reforms and their possible consequences. And in one of the questions, we indicate that market controls will cause local merchants to go out of business as one of Sima Guang's possible objections. In another question, however, we have the same set of answers, but say that the collective security militia system displaces the jobs of local patrolmen. I do apologize. The question that indicates the correct answer to be the collective security military system displacing the jobs of local patrolmen was mistakenly placed into the assessments. It shouldn't have been there, and you were right to point that out as a problem. Also, a number of our astute readers have, in the readings, located the fact that one of Sima Guang's paragraphs could be construed to be an argument that market controls do in fact cause local merchants to go out of business, which we had indicated as not an argument made by Sima Guang. And indeed, we're inclined to agree with you on that interpretation enough to have made some changes to the grading scheme.
The grades of these two questions have been reset to 0 from 1 point, so your grades are not going to be affected, and we're not trying to trick you. This really was an error, and we apologize. On another matter, a practical matter, before we get into student feedback, how can students download the Chinese version of some of these texts?
In the reference sections, there will be an item that says reading in Chinese, so please look for that item.
Okay. Now you all have really engaged, I have to say, and thank you very much, with the issues around Wang Anshi's reforms and the intense controversy that they caused, not only at the time, but throughout Chinese history from that point until the present. And we asked you to consider the debates about them, which ones are the most controversial, why, and which with what groups. How does it resonate with you in your own country today? And we got some incredibly interesting responses. You want to read Jerry Tan's response?
We had a fantastic one. The first set deal with the market, and so Jerry Tan has brought up the market's effects as being much larger and more immediate than any of the effects of the other new policies, and thus people taking opposition to it on a much wider scale and much more quickly. He also had a very interesting point about federalism.
Right, that this was in some sense similar to the American experience in terms of the idea of a greater centralization of the American government, or taking an alternative approach of a more confederated arrangement of the Articles of Confederation, recognizing, as many states actually believed, even the Constitution of the United States, the states as sovereign states. The one flaw that I would see with this analogy is that no one is looking at the different localities in China as sovereign states in this period of time. Greater local autonomy is one thing, but actual formal local autonomy in a world in which there is still one son of heaven is not in the cards. So we have Christine Y, who said that these are really good reforms. Farmers can borrow at lower rates. Urban people can get goods at fair prices. No need to fund a huge military. What's wrong with that? Well, part of it is, of course, the state's emphasis on control, the setting of prices, and so on, actually leads to a limitation of lending over time, or allows people to take on more credit that they can afford to do. And it's done in the absence of understanding, perhaps, as Christine shows, of the economic rules that actually guide human behavior more often than not.
Christine made a great point about once the government starts adding the burden of more taxes to pay for these reforms, that's when she says that the system really takes a nosedive. So sort of taking the reforms home to people's wallets really affects them there.
You know, China, maybe we made this point in an earlier office hour, and it'll come up when we get to the 20th century, but Chinese have been extremely inventive in forms of taxation. I believe it was a part of Sichuan in the 1930s that a militarist in Sichuan was getting revenue from the local land tax, very typical thing in Chinese history, and he wasn't getting enough on an annual basis, so he started to collect the land tax in advance. And in 1932, he was collecting the land tax for 1972. Really pretty inventive.
Yes.
So who's next do we have?
Janice breaks down the new policies and talks about the evolution from a more private economy to a more government-controlled economy, and this being a real sticking point, a point of contention. And the result that Janice points out is frequently one of confusion and suspicion, and a worry on everybody's part that this, taken further, could not only make things worse for them and their interests, but for the economy as a whole, for the country as a whole. And we have the idea that this is a zero-sum game between people and government, and between change and continuity.
Now, the fact of the matter is we have almost no idea what ordinary non-elite people think about any of this, except insofar as other actions indicate their beliefs, because this is a debate largely among elites. So we always have to be careful when we talk about the people, even today. But Janice makes one point here where she talks about some of the issues of some of the content of Wang Anshi's policies. She talks about farm loans done by the state, formerly only by private, now the government. New taxes to support infrastructure. New responsibilities to contribute to armed force through the government. The requirement that government-related transactions be done in cash. A lot of these things, if you were thinking of them in the context of American history, sound a little bit like the New Deal. Certainly, we still have a farm subsidy program that dates back to this period. And the opposition to, I wouldn't say that Franklin Roosevelt is the Wang Anshi of his day, although the reaction among American elites to President Roosevelt's reforms in the New Deal in the aftermath of the Depression was as fierce, although not as successful, as the reaction to that of Wang Anshi.
What prevented them from being successful?
Because he won re-election by a landslide 4 times. 3 times, he won the presidency 4 times. Now, if Wang Anshi had actually been, if people could have voted for Wang Anshi, we have no clue. We can't really transpose easily one historical experience to another, but when Franklin Roosevelt took his case to the people, he would be elected time and time and time again.
So taking it to the people. And then we get into education.
Education, very.
Yes.
Okay, so Arya D says that of all of Wang Anshi's policy, the most controversial was education, and had the most heated debate. The idea was to promote meritocracy, equality and literacy, and to enable social mobility. So let me ask you, Philip, who could be opposed to meritocracy, equality and literacy, and social mobility? Who could possibly be opposed to that?
Well, on the surface, nobody. But then in reality, once the reforms are implemented, it turns out everybody.
Everyone who stands to lose by greater equality or by the social mobility of others.
Absolutely, but there's the other interesting point that she makes in the case of Sri Lanka, her home country, that once the reforms, in fact, are implemented on the widest scale possible, in fact, representing everybody or drawing everybody in, that everybody loses and everybody complains. So Ariadne points out that this free education policy post 1945 in Sri Lanka has basically stripped education of, it's on the one hand educated a much wider group of people, resulting in extremely high literacy, but on the other hand, without competition, with corruption, without real hard oversight, people are not being prepared for the world in which they enter. And so we have Sima Guang type arguments she mentions. We also have Sushers of Sri Lanka, as Ariadne mentions. So it was a fascinating
that's an excellent
response.
It was very thoughtful response. Imelva, and this is, I think, a really fascinating one. One of the most controversial reforms proposed was to change the emphasis of poetry for those entering public service.
Yes.
When you think of this in the American context, you know, I wonder if there was a time when people in Congress were poets. There definitely aren't any today that I know of. In any event, educational reform was proposed again and again, and we see some of the same discussions behind the proposals during the Song. Rote learning is not real education. People talk about this in China today, but also in the United States. Entry-level exams do not measure the right things. Every one of you whose children didn't get into the college that you wanted to because of that stupid SAT, and I totally sympathize with you. You are right to be concerned about standardized examinations. Arts and a mature understanding of the world. How do we actually integrate those into what it means to be learned and what it means to be wise when choosing people who are going to enter public affairs? Knowledge that is not tested. Today, digital knowledge and competencies under-tested in many colleges and many other things that will need to make one successful in life, not on the exam.
Yes.
Somehow or other, these are ancient and very current questions.
Absolutely, extremely enduring. And we have another response that talks about the application of these questions to the school system. So we have Everbola talking about Wang Anshi's school system having a good sense of meritocracy, where the clan and family from which a person hails is not important for him to have a go at a high office. And we have this same question of, once we've changed the education that prepares people for the world in which they're supposed to enter, how do we change the other methods of access? And how do we change this idea of what it takes to have a go at things? And so we talk about the consequences here of meritocracy, the abilities of a person despite their background to have a shot at things.
And he says that in his own country, really a pretty strong statement here, in my homeland of Malaysia, sadly, the Sima Guang system prevails. Meritocracy is all but dead. And the literati belong to almost all to one clan, one ethnicity.
Right.
That's quite a statement. He says, as stated by Su Shi, when the common people, the farmers, cannot pay, they run away. In the same way, in my homeland, when the best and most learned young students, people who would be literati in another era and in another place, don't get the opportunity, they run away, and brain drain is the result. Fascinating comment.
It's a brilliant comment. And then we start getting into the relationship between government and people. And so we have Chaz 77 mentioning that Wang Anshi's policies represent extreme big government. His heart was in the right place in trying to use government to help the common man. One of his mistakes, however, may have been related to his opinion that good men in government have been hampered in their ability to serve the common good by regulations that restrict them. And the problem of eliminating checks and balances, which Wang Anshi set out to do, and which any sort of a government really sets out to do, eliminating red tape, as we talk about, eliminating the checks that prevent real action. However, as Chaz 77 points out, we do have a problem when sometimes these checks are eliminated. And one of the problems that Chaz engages here is the crop loan program of Wang Anshi, and the problem of having the government loaning to the people and making loans that they can't afford.
That the people cannot afford to repay.
Yes.
Right.
And Chaz 77 likens this to the events leading up to the 2008 housing collapse, when mortgage loans were pushed on those clearly unable to repay them, by unscrupulous brokers in search of profit. However, the government did not make the loan. Although the government did not make the loans, it passed laws to encourage making mortgage loans to the poor.
Right, that's absolutely right. BHO writes about the militia policy.
Yeah, so we're transitioning into the effectiveness of the organization of the military, of society in terms of militias, of neighborhoods under Wang Anshi's new policies. And BHO mentions that the militia policy was in fact most controversial and also most problematic. Mutual liability and surveillance robbed people of privacy and encouraged conflicts among neighbors. Also, accountability and justice were ignored.
He says that it's a bit of a leap, perhaps, but it's a little bit like the United States Congress and the United States President today, although he says it's still not yet as bad as it was in 11th century China. Thank goodness for that. Then Priscilla and Jason write about the laws that threatened the status of the elite and means of selecting officials, the examination system, and so on, and compares this to something going on in the United States at this moment.
Right. Both Priscilla and Jason hit on healthcare reforms in the United States as
we're talking to you on the day after the last day that you could sign up in the United States for the new government subsidized health care.
That's a good point. And basically the idea here is that the people who stand to lose something, the elites, are most effective in mobilizing opposition to these sorts of reforms.
That's right. And even those who may benefit from reforms may be mobilized in opposition then as now.
Right, and then Jason had another point about actually carrying out the reforms, the problem of carrying out the reforms, the civil servants not being able to carry them out, and that in effect derailing the good efforts of government as well.
And here, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but just from personal experience with my own family, signing up for, one of my members of my family signing up for the new healthcare enterprise in the United States in the liberal state of Massachusetts, which has the absolute worst performing website of the entire country, something that crashed and burned many, many times and incredibly underperforming. I just wanted to vent a moment about that because I'm still ticked off.
Did you eventually sign up though?
Yeah, but only through the website of a private insurer.
I see.
So, because it worked.
Unfortunately, that goes.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Our final set of points get into the Baojia system again, and its roots, its historical roots, and the problems that plague this system throughout history of getting neighbors to watch each other and having punishment be collective. And basically, this destroys, in the opinions of our commenters here, the very structure of society in terms of neighborhoods, families, accountability within villages.
Gustane. This makes the point, if you're to look for modern parallels, you can look at China during the Cultural Revolution, people reporting on each other, students on teachers, family members one on another, children on parents, and so on. Actually, I think that was Thilo Flake gives the point, and this is a good parallel, not an American one. Reminds me of the neighborhood watch system in old East Germany, the old German Democratic Republic. Everyone felt constantly watched. And they were watched, too. Indeed, a very uncomfortable way to live. And Chris J20M says, this system is still in full force in North Korea today. My guess is, quite frankly, the Koreans have taken this much further, sadly, with the combination of very traditional forms of mutual surveillance and modern totalitarian forms of intimidation than ever could be imagined in Song China. But perhaps the foundations are there.
Yes. And just finally, we wanted to say a quick word about another confusing question.
Oh, yet another confusing question. Yeah, right.
It was dealing with this contention that Wang Anshi's policies were seen as one of the greatest failed experiments in Chinese history, and one of our viewers wanted to know where did this occur?
Where did Bowl actually say any of that?
Yes.
And in fact, he probably, in the video you have, he didn't say it in so explicit a term. And it's a good question to keep in mind. not because there is actually just a right or wrong answer. Is this one of the greatest failed experiments in Chinese history? That might mean because it was one of the greatest experiments in Chinese history. It might mean it's also failed, or at least it was not enacted. It did not have a long, immediate afterlife. But if you want to look for the greatest failed experiments in Chinese history, you really have to wait until much later in this course, because you ain't seen nothing yet.
Thank you. And just one last final point about
please,
painting. So in the weekly digest, there will be a question, a survey question. So now that you've dealt with these three thinkers, their ideas and their effects on the society of their time, and we've looked at the set of paintings, please do take a moment to click on the survey question that we put out in tomorrow's digest and share with your fellow learners which painting you think corresponds with which thinker and figure.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Philip.
Thank you,
and Professor Bo, wherever you are, I hope you're listening in and correcting all these complex and overly complicated assessments. Thank you, guys. See you next week.
Thank you so much.